Hey, it's Sneak History Channel. Tonight we're going to be reading the postscript of Everything You Love Will Burn Inside the Rebirth of American White Nationalism by Vegas Tenold. Postscript. The hard right. Of course, Pikeville wasn't my last event, and I don't know why I assumed it would be. Writing a book about something that is so ongoing is a surreal affair because one needs to decide at some point when the story in the book ends and whereas real life continues unaffected by narrative concerns. There's always the next rally with something bigger and more consequential. In this story, it was Charlottesville. Pikeville changed almost nothing. For all the talk, press, online bolster, police presence, shops closing, plane tickets bought, and miles traveled by people to get there had zero effect on anything. The Nationalist Front gained one new group, the Exalted White Knights out of Alabama, who promised they weren't white supremacists and claimed they were committed to the politics as Matthew was. People had fun, though, and it was decided that the far right should do these kind of events more often. And other than that, things went back to normal. Matthew went back home and set about relocating his family to Tennessee. Early in May, his second son, Patrick Heimbach, was born. Charlottesville would build on the solidarity created in Pikeville. It was given the hashtag friendly name Unite the Right and was to be a grand, much overdue coming together of the leaders of the alt and far right. The lineup of speakers was unquestionably impressive, living up to the name of the rally. Richard Spencer would be there as David Duke. Matthew and Mike Enoch. Also scheduled to speak were David Hill, founder of the League of the South, and the alt-right internet luminary, and Tim Guionnet, aka Based Alaska, who announced in his Twitter feed the eve of the rally, "Tomorrow we make history at Unite the Right." Matthew had top billing. His name was on the poster along with other prominent leaders of the far right. He had arrived. I hadn't planned on going. I'd been to more than my fair share of these things and I wanted to be done with it. But throughout the summer of 2017, as the rally drew near, Matthew began telling me that Antifa promised to bring thousands to Charlottesville. According to him, they were flying from New York, Chicago, and Oakland, as well as bussing in from Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. At the same time, the number of threats against him had been increasing. In the end, a mixed curiosity of fear of missing out and force drew me to Charlottesville. I had been going to these things for so long it seemed strange not to. I hadn't seen Matthew and the rest of the TWP members since Pikeville, but once I arrived in Charlottesville, it immediately felt like something had changed. The night before the rally, a few of the members kicked me out of a party at their house. I brought another journalist who they immediately suspected was a Jewish spy, and Scott, Matthew's gormless henchman, fetched a bacon pizza and asked her to eat it in what he believed was a clever ruse to ferret out Jewish infiltrators. There was an edge to the crowd I hadn't seen before. There were more guns I was used to and more bravado. As soon as I got there, Matthew Parrott told me I had to leave. Nazi Joe was here and he'd be fucking pissed if we invited a journalist. He's going to come up and start something. You guys better get out. As a menacing name it was, I soon found out was Nazi Joe was the alias of the TWP used for Eric Stryker, undoubtedly another alias. Stryker was a short, skinny kid with a big head and cartoonish features who liked to rant against Jews on the website Daily Stormer. He was about as daunting as a very small dog. His animosity spread among the usually bookish TWP crowd, and in some way I couldn't put my finger on it, altered the tenor of my relationship with the group. Matthew wasn't there, but Stryker said he spoke for him when he said I could stay, but the kike had to go. I was taken aback by the aggression. It felt more like a skinhead gathering than a TWP party. The next day provided further hints Matthew was hardening, slipping further to the right. A couple dozen TWP members in matching uniforms and construction helmets gathered early in the morning in a parking structure a couple of blocks from the park where the rally would take place. They were the tip near the spear, primed in the case the Antifa was there. Then came the LOS, League of the South, National Socialist Movement, NSM, and a few other groups. All there must have been close to 100 people, all marching behind Matthew. He wore his new uniform, a snug black shirt that stretched over his paunch, a black armband embezzled with the silver logo of the TWP, and a black tie stuffed into the buttons of his shirt. Unlike his men, he didn't carry a shield or a club. His helmet was a military-style combat helmet rather than a construction hat. One of the guys from the League of South was telling the group to use clubs against the abdomen, not the head. The head was assault, the abdomen one was not. I was completely convinced he knew what he was talking about, but to be fair, he also said not to strike unless the enemy struck first, which I guess made it all more legal. We're not the alt-right and we're not the far-right, he roared. We're the hard right. A pickup rolled up, as to Under's Point, Chester Doles, Peaches, and a couple other guys from the Confederate Hammerskins jumped out. I was so surprised to see them, but not as surprised as Gabe, who had not left the Hammerskins in good trim. Did you know about this? I asked Matthew. Of course, he said. Me and Chester had been talking. They wanted to get political. This was either a lie or Matthew was delusional. Thinking the Hammerskins could be a political group was like believing a pack of hungry wolves could perform community theater. It was just entertaining, though, but clearly the wolves would have just eat the audience and everyone else. I looked at Matthew's crowd again. Spencer wasn't there. He, Mike Enoch, and the members of the American Vanguard, Identity Europa, and everyone else who belonged to what has become known as White Nationalism 2.0, simply another term for the suits of the movement, were meeting elsewhere. This was the 1.0 crowd, and I was struck by the realization that Matthew, who had once spent a freezing day march outside the Conservative Political Action Committee, happily arguing conservative, was now a completely different person from the ones I had met years ago. The transition had been gradual, and perhaps I had been too close to see it. Much like you don't see yourself aging, I had failed to see Matthew's politics harden over time. Now, in the stark glare of the parking lot fluorescence, surrounded by what can be described as troops shaking hands with the Hammerskins, marching with the old guard of the movement, his transformation was obvious. Matthew was no longer the affable new face of organized hate, but rather someone who believed he was at war. The rally in Charlottesville was terrible and inevitable. After egging each other years on, after threats, small and not so couches, a countless boasts of glory for fighting for one's race, the justness of smashing the fascist words, Antifa and the far right finally got their battle. It was ugly, violent, and tragic, and when it was over, had torn the far right completely apart. The TWP party that night, as if someone had just died at a rally they had taken part in. They told themselves they had been attacked and that Heather Heyer, to the degree they mentioned her, was an enemy combatant who had died in battle. The next day, Matthew put out a bland statement blaming the left for inciting violence. I remember how during the inauguration he screamed at a car driving through demonstrators to fucking run them over. I was convinced at the time it was a hyperbole, but seeing how little he cared for a life that had been lost, I wondered if I had misjudged his capacity for cruelty and violence. As long as I knew him, Matthew would use the term "they are literally killing us" with a great pathos as he described the alleged attacks against whites by elites and Jews. Now that a person had died, he refused to even name her. Matthew Parrott wrote on Facebook, as far as he concerned, James Alex Fields, the driver of the car that ran into the council protesters and killed Heather Heyer, was an honorary member of the TWP in life. Jason Kessler, until then, was a relatively unknown organizer of the event. Tweeted out an article from the Daily Stormal that in graphic terms calls Heather Heyer a communist and implied that she was, by extension, responsible for the Gulag and all the other atrocities performed in the name of communism. In these days and the week that followed, the schism appeared to be between those who had took a hard-nosed approach to the events at Charlottesville and those who didn't. Richard Spencer disavowed Kessler after the street and expressed regret that Heather Heyer had died. He immediately labeled the coward and sellout by those who believed Heather was an enemy combatant. American Vanguard, the group of which Fields allegedly belonged, claimed he was not one of theirs, maintaining that Fields was just a guy who happened to dress like them and got his hands on one of their shields. Matthew believed the murder in Charlottesville would break American Vanguard. They don't have the maturity as a group or the infrastructure to be able to absorb something like this, he told me over the phone. They'll vanish soon enough. Unite the right, expose their weakness in the white nationalist movement in America. Despite the fact that race is a clear issue in American life, a majority of Americans, most of them white, favor keeping Confederate monuments in public spaces. The aftermath of Charlottesville showing merely a sharing of devotion to white heritage isn't enough to sustain the movement, especially one that experienced such cruelty and outrage. Despite its name, the Unite the Right was never truly united in anything but being white and angry. According to many who took part took part in arranging the event. The speakers list included 12 names, all from different factions, suggesting that it wasn't so much an event for various groups coming together, as it was the place for aspiring leaders on the far right to be seen. The bickering, disavowals, counter-disavowals in the wake of Charlottesville are a reminder that, for all the attention to receive and the hysteria created, the far right movement and still America had no idea what it was doing. This isn't to say that the groups and their members on their own aren't capable of violence, harassment, and even acts of terror, merely that corralling their efforts into a focused political movement would have been akin to herding a flock of particularly hateful and racist cats. I think everyone is shell-shocked right now, the far-right blogger Brad Griffin told me. I don't think this is near as big a deal as some people are making out to me. The tempest will calm down and the news cycle will roll on. We should hold a big event on private property in the fall after we resume some activism as a tactic. After Charlottesville, Matthew didn't want to do any more rallies. There's no point to them, he said. We never get to speak anyway. He's still moving more of his guys to his property in Tennessee. One of his members had donated $40,000 that he was going to spend on a lumber machine so he can build what he called an Amish-like community on his property. He still wanted to build his white homeland, but seemingly abandoning all plans of working with Spencer and the suits. Charlottesville proved that people are going to call you Nazis regardless. There's no center anymore. There's no moderation. If you want to be in the movement, you better be prepared to put on the helmet and armband and get into the streets. As he saw it, Charlottesville had been an unmediated success. He found out who his friends were and his enemies were. Spencer, he believed, was a flash in the pan. His approach was doomed to fizzle out or be taken over by the GOP. Identity Europa were cowards who had fled the fight. The Hammerskids had held more promise, but they hadn't agreed to join the NF. But Matthew was talking to Cheshire regularly, and they were already discussing how they could come aboard. The focus going forward needs to be community organizing, he said. We need to show people that we care. Still, I found it hard to believe that he was that naive. He had come a long way since I first met him, but he'd also not moved an inch. No one can argue that he had created an alliance of disparate far-right groups. He had created an organization, but somehow housed neo-Nazis, KKK, alt-right, and other races. But it begged a question: to what end? His friends from his former life, the ones that included Youth for Civilization, had moved on, some to influential positions with conservative circles. But Matthew, for all his eloquence and ability, was now an avowed National Socialist, a dedicated anti-Semite, and the de facto leader of some of the most radical white supremacists in the nation. He still maintained that his end goal was a true party for the white working man, and he still considered other races inferior anyway, but at the same time he was rubbing elbows with the most alienating crowd conceivable. All his plan was to work locally and convince everyday Americans that fascism was their friend. He convinced himself he could do it with the help of a Klansman skinhead tattoos. Where he had once ridiculed Jeff Show for being delusional enough to believe that the American public might be get behind a party supporting the swastika, Matthew now believed the public would somehow trust the friendly neighborhood Hammerskids with kill nigger tattoos and all. Ultimately, I believe the far right in America, at least the incarceration I spent years covering, is destined to fail. Not because America is inherently good and the forces of justice and progress are always stronger than those intolerance, but because white supremacy is doing just fine without the far right. The country has spent decades perfecting an ostensibly non-racial form of white supremacy, and it is serving with remarkable efficiency. Private prisons, mandatory sentencing, seemingly unchecked police power, gerrymandering, increasing limited access to healthcare and abortion are all trends, yet ingenious web designed to keep poor people and powerless. That's why people caught in that web too. But when it comes to those experiencing poverty, African Americans, Native Americans, and Latino Americans vastly outnumber whites. The people Matthew was ostensibly fighting for, the broken, beaten, and forgotten whites of Appalachia and the Rust Belt, were victims in a war against white people, but a rather collateral damage in a war against poor people and ethnic racial minorities. I believe that Matthew was right when he said the elites and politicians hate his people, but they don't hate them because they're white. They hate them because they're poor. In an essay posted on his blog Occidental Descent, Brad Griffin described how one of the failures of nationalism is that it become too extreme. According to Griffin, it attracted an audience of edge cases, naturally disagreeable people incapable of finding common ground. Their message was presentation was stupid, vicious, crazy, and ugly. It was easier for the opposition to brand these people with stereotypes and marginalize them. He didn't say as much, but he was describing the groups that Matthew was surrounding himself with. According to him, nationalism 2.0 was different because society was fundamentally different. First and foremost, he attributed the rise of social media and Donald Trump. Donald Trump was the rock that white America finally threw the glass window of the status quo. He wrote, political correctness was falling by the wayside, and a new nationalist movement would be there to articulate a new vision of society. The only problem with Griffin's line is thinking that the leaders of the alt-right, as well as the movement's members, had been unable to come up with a vision inside trolling the vast swaths of the population who fell into the groups the alt-right had a problem with: feminists, liberals, LGBTQ, African Americans, Latino Americans, Jews, and belaking the whites that were being replaced. It wasn't a policy format as much as a series of gripes and offensive jokes. I claimed that Americans were tired of political correctness, a dead horse that Trump had flogged. Since the gusto they began his games was largely unfounded beyond the echo chambers of the internet. The alt-right's first attempt at real world activism, the debacle in Charlottesville, has decimated them. It couldn't have gotten worse. They hadn't been heard, only seen, and the sights of white nationalists marching in the hundreds on American Street had largely frightened and disgusted Americans. The aftermath revealed that there were more people willing to take the streets to protest the nationalists than people willing to stand with them. In the light of the tragedy in Charlottesville, Griffin's ideas about how the far right would forge ahead, shifting into the real world, will create stronger bonds with people to get to know each other and work. It will be fun, a positive atmosphere that the disaffected want joining us, seemingly laughably naive. In the end, Matthew both succeeded and failed at the same time. He built a large alliance on the right that he also dreamed of, but it was darker and angrier and more extreme version than what he had pitched me all those years ago. If his plan was to build an alliance to win the hearts of the mind, those who weren't red-pilled, then his goal seemed further away than ever. There was a reason why the NSM had been around since the 60s with almost nothing to show for it. Despite the latent racism in America and the implicit and explicit and implicit white supremacy built into the fabric of the society, National Socialism would always be a fringe outlier. By succeeding, Matthew had made the same mistakes all the coalition builders before him made. The NF would never be a political force in America. If Matthew played his cards right, he might become the next George Lincoln Rockwell, William Luther Pierce, or Richard Butler. But his steady path further and further right only geared him to one street. Matthew Heimbach would also always be an extremist.